because this might take just that little bit longer. It's a bit of a weird one because it is not a simple tense like the rest of them. It's a compound one. Compound meaning it requires two parts for it to be correct. And those two parts are the auxiliary and the passé participe of the verb in question. The auxiliary being the present tense of avoir or être depending on the verb that's proceeding, that's coming afterwards, and passé participe, which is it's kind of like the way you conjugate all your other verbs or all your other tenses, but just much simpler because it doesn't change for the person in question. It doesn't change, it just remains constant regardless of who's speaking. The auxiliary will change, as in the avoir and the être will change depending on who's speaking or being spoke or the action, the subject of the action. But the passé participe will not. So your er, for example, you take off the er and you add ing. That's how you change a verb to its passé participe. An er verb, you take off the er and you add ing. And that will stay the same regardless of if it's je, tu, il, elle, nous, it still stays the same. So to give, donner, you take off er and you add ing, sharpens the sound. So instead of don, you have donner. And that donner will stay the same even if it's il, elle, nous, vous, whatever. But then the auxiliary will change. The auxiliary will change to fit the subject, obviously. So you can't say vous et or something, or vous a, whatever. It have to be vous avez or nous avons, or you know what I mean. It just goes without saying that the auxiliary will change to suit the person in question. Anyway, kind of waffled on, of course, again. I need to stay focused, don't I? Or I will confuse people. Where was I? Sorry. IR, right. So to change an IR verb to its passé participe, you just remove the R and you're left with the I, basically. So using finir, you remove the R, you're left with I. That's just it. Vendre, you remove the RE and you're left with U. So vendre would be vendu. Yeah. That's all you need to know for the passé participe. That is it. It's a simple part of it. It's the simplest thing about the verb, really. It's just putting it together that takes people off. So you have your auxiliary now, gotten, depending on the person in question. If it's je, or if it's nous, or if it's vous, you have your auxiliary. And you have your passé participe. Put those together, and you have your passé composé. If you put them in separately or in any way different than that, it's wrong. It's not the verb anymore. It's something different or wrong. So using, for example, I gave as my example, you have j'ai, which is J apostrophe AI, which is your avoir conjugated in respect to J, whereas in respect to je. So you have j'ai donné, which is your J apostrophe AI, donne, a g. Even though that was a really garbled and nonsense explanation, I do hope you understand what I'm saying. Moving on to discussing the auxiliaries in more detail now. The auxiliary verb, like I said, could be avoir or être depending on the verb coming after that. So 13 verbs, or at least on your Lebensjahr course anyway, only 13 are done with être. So if you're really stuck and you don't know which one, which you should, I'll teach you how to know that in a second, really stuck and you just really lost, just go with avoir because 99% of verbs are done with avoir. Only 13 out of like the indefinite number of verbs you could be using are done with être. So your être verbs are, the ones I can think of off the top of my head now are aller, arriver, entre, descendre, or descendre, monter, mourir, naître, partir, sortir, venir, tomber. Yes. Pretty much all of them. I think I mentioned entre. Anyway, so basically the trick is just you learn those 13 verbs inside out, upside down. You know these are done with être, these are done with être. So when you see a verb, you have to conjugate in the passé composé. You're not exactly sure which one it is, as in you don't just know instantly off the top of your head like you will with some verbs which one it is. You just quickly, mentally rifle through the list in your head. Okay, it's not on that list, so it's not done with être, hence it must be done with avoir. That's just the way you do it. That just makes life very, very simple for you because there's nothing worse than like losing all the core marks just because you're making all the little mistakes like using the wrong auxiliary and all that kind of thing. Now one last thing to mention as well, apart from going through regular verbs, but that just goes without saying, like I said, there's always irregular verbs in every tense, and they tend to be the same verbs going all through. But I'll just say something quickly on that before we move on to the next tense. What is important for me to mention is that être verbs, or être verbs will agree with the subject. By that I mean any verb that's conjugated with être in the passé composé, the passé participe will agree with the subject. By that I mean if the person who is the subject of the action, not she gave, because gave is done with avoir, she went, aller is done with être, or she came down, or she returned, or she came, those kind of words, those verbs that are done with être, they agree with the subject. So she would take on an e, the passé participe would take on an e, so she went, elle est allée, and that allée will be spelled A-L-L-E, a g and another e. So that's what I mean by agreeing with the subject. Avoir verbs are a bit weirder. They generally could go through avoir verbs and just go as a rule that they don't agree with anything. But the real truth is that they agree with the object if it precedes the subject in the sentence. So yeah, that's kind of like gay, and most people just prefer to just go, they don't agree with anything. Some French teachers will genuinely just tell you over that, especially if you're doing ordinary level, you can get away with just saying avoir verbs don't agree with anything, and être verbs agree with the subject. But that's not true, especially if you're at higher level. You need to understand that avoir verbs will agree with the object of the action if it's feminine or plural, and it's preceding the subject in the sentence. So if your sentence is written in a way that's kind of like the car which he bought. The car is feminine, la voiture, so that means your bought, your acheté, is going to be ig and another e. But if you have just he bought a car, that's not going to happen, because then your object is after your subject. But if it's written in the other way, like I said, and it's preceding your subject, then it agrees. But if that's really, really hard, just say that it doesn't agree with anything, and just be careful not to write your sentences in that gay kind of way. Yeah. Trying to see, am I leaving out anything? Just anyway, just quickly recap on that. Être verbs, they agree with the subject, so that means feminine e, plural s, feminine and plural es, added onto the passé participe. And avoir verbs agree with the object if it's preceding the subject. Yeah.